everybody. We're going to get this class started here. It's 5 o'clock, and tonight's class is going to be sort of a beginner's class. But even if you've been planting, maybe you can see what you've been doing wrong, or you have questions about like what's happening in your yard with your landscape, or some even a particular plant. Especially during the Q&A part, you can ask specific questions. But we're going to go over the basics of getting a plant started and basic plant care. We will have a more in-depth class, I think it's next week, on plant nutrition, composting, and how to make your microbial fauna and flora, there's Katie, happy in your garden and landscape. So anyway, the classes that we have coming up, let's see here. The classes we have coming up, Digging Deep is next week, and that's, again, compost, plant nutrition, and soil biology. Then native plants of Baja, Arizona, native plant foods. That's all about what the native foods we have from our native plant flora. So we'll talk about wolfberries and cacti and all that stuff. But we'll not only talk about the historical use of those plants, but also we'll talk about some modern interpretations of those food production, and also about some future crops. Then then the week after that, we'll talk about container gardening, everything related to container gardening, and then the rest of the classes you could take a look on there, and all these classes are listed on our website under online classes, and they go into depth about what we're growing into, and we'll be adding more on as time goes on. So, and we're always open to suggestions about what classes you would like to see us do. We've already had some really great suggestions that we're going to be adding into our schedule. So anyway, let's get on with the class. Again, this is the class on establishing new plants and basic plant care. And just as an aside here, anyone who's watching this, our goal isn't to make a lot of money on this. We just want to pay for it. So if you have the means to pay, follow the links on our website, and there's several methods of paying. And if you can't, we don't want anyone held back because they can't afford it, especially in these times where people have lost their jobs or they're in quarantine and they can't work or whatever it is. Like, we want people to still be able to have access to this information. So so those who can afford to do what you can, but if not, don't worry about it. Anyway, so let's get on with the class, shall we? I want to ask you, do you still dress like this? You may know what's going to happen here because we've posted memes about this before, but people don't dress like this anymore, right? So why do people plant gardens like this or landscapes like this? And where I'm getting at here, it's not a design. This isn't a design statement. This is a statement about taking care of plants. And I think this is an old way of thinking. It's forcing plants to behave like furniture. And plants are not furniture. Plants are living things. And this is this perspective we always come from. You're always going to get this from us. We're annoying about it because we want you to know that this is all about making living things thrive in your backyard, and not just the things you intend. Sometimes it's the things that come in and eat some leaves off your plant. And if you are a little more, give more allowances for these types of things to happen, your whole landscape will flourish more. People cause so many problems by fighting nature, so just stop fighting nature. And cactus are not very fun to sit on, is also what's going on there. So anytime you're thinking about plants and how to take care of them, you want to think about their ecological niches and their habitat. Not every plant is in the same kind of place, even in our, well, especially in our landscape. We have a very, feel free to interrupt me with any questions if they're appropriate for right now. We have a very diverse landscape. Okay, so and everything that people do in other parts of the country, almost you could just throw that out. If you're from Minnesota or New York or California, just throw out what you know, because it's almost the opposite here. And there's a reason for that. We live in this place that is, we call it the Sky Islands. And the Sky Islands are a geological province that was built upon faults that pulled away from each other, and then valleys that fell down. And as a consequence, you have all these mountains all around and basins in between, which are desert grasslands and Sonoran Desert and Chihuahuan Desert. We have a very diverse landscape. And within our landscape are so many specific ecological niches. There's riparian zones, there's nurse plants, there's all kinds of niches that these plants find themselves in. And that's going to give you a little bit of a hint as to what they need and how to take care of them. And even you don't have to memorize this kind of stuff, because that's our job. Your job is to ask the right questions. And so it starts off with when you go to buy a plant, or even before you buy the plant, when you decide what to plant. So the kind of things you want to think about before you plant anything is like the ultimate dimensions. How big is this thing going to get? How tall and how wide? One of the biggest mistakes I've seen people make is they plant everything that and make them look good as it looks right now. So they got a bunch of 1-gallon plants and maybe a couple 5-gallon plants, and they put them all together. And then next year they're all growing into each other because they didn't think, oh yeah, this thing gets 4 feet wide, or this other plant gets 7 feet tall or 8 feet tall, and it's shading this other thing out. So you have to pay attention to how big is that plant going to get. We will always tell you. And we don't know this stuff, all these details about these plants. We know a lot, but we have to look it up a lot of the times. I don't always remember, and I have to think, oh yeah, how tall does the screwbean mesquite get? I have to look it up sometimes, or the hardiness of a plant. But anyway, the size. How big is this plant going to get? That's something you need to take into consideration. What kind of sun exposure does it need? Again, we will tell you. We will tell you our experience with it. And by the way, things don't always behave the same way in cultivation as they do in nature, and that's why we're here to help. But yeah, sun exposure is something you need to pay attention to. How much sun can this thing take? Can it take shade? Some people think everything needs shade. Actually, most plants need some sun. And it's not about this. Plants don't have a hard time with our sun. That's not the issue. The issue is usually water, but or soil soil biology. You had a question.
Somebody said that they were told once to overplant and then cull.
With the landscape plants, it's not a great idea. With your garden, that's a great idea. In fact, that's what we do if we're planting, especially our winter vegetables. We'll plant a row of, let's say, mustard greens or lettuce or something, and then thin them out as they get bigger. You can do that. But with landscape plants, it doesn't apply as much, or it's a very wasteful way of doing it, because you're gonna these are living things. You don't want to just plant a plant just so it'll get crowded out and die. So not my suggestion to do that. All right, so another thing to think about is one of the most obvious things here in Arizona, and that's water. And this is where most people have an issue, this and nutrition. I don't think I put a slide in here for nutritional needs either, but that's a very important thing to understand as well. is how much nutrition does it need. It's a little bit more of a hazy subject too, because even a creosote bush, if you give it some compost when you plant it, it's going to be happy about it. It doesn't want to live in a crap world. It just can. So anyway, water needs, like how much water is this plant going to need? Not only when you first plant it, but later. And most plants in the beginning are the same, are very similar. And right now, if you plant, you're going to water every day, unless it's a creosote bush or a smoke bush. We just got smoke trees in Sorothamnus spinosus. It's a really cool plant from western Arizona. That's a little bit more like creosote bush. You water it every other day. But the point being is just understand what its water needs are, especially later. And water needs goes along with some other things that I'm going to talk about in a second too. Frost tolerance is something you need to pay attention to, especially here because we live in such a diverse place. On one side of town, it's almost tropical. It's almost no frost at all. And then on another side of town, it's nearly grassland. We live when you're in a dry landscape, the temperatures vary a lot because water and humidity hold heat. And so it makes it harder for the temperatures to rise and fall really fast in a humid environment. We don't live in a humid environment. Even in our summer monsoon, it's dry. And we live in one of the few places where it can go from 110 and then you get monsoon rains and then suddenly it's like 65 outside. It's something that doesn't happen in very many parts of the world within an hour. So anyway, what I'm getting at though is that plants in our region, some of them have found the little niche that's the warm niche, like in some of the foothill areas that are away from water, where water flows down, and they're a little higher up. It's almost tropical. There's like no frost. There's parts downtown or on the university that almost see no frost. And then you get out to Oro Valley or Oracle, and it's like you're starting to get into grassland. Same with Green Valley. So, and then of course some of the people watching might be from Cochise County, or even Santa Cruz County or Cochise County, or even I don't know if there's some people watching from, is it Graham County? Yeah, Graham County, or Greenlee. I doubt it, but anyway. Frost tolerance is something you want to pay attention to. Ask how much cold a plant can take. Seasonality is a very important thing to pay attention to. Now, when I was talking about watering, I'll give you a good example. Cacti. Let's talk about cactus. There is, let's say Trichoceros, what's the common name for that? Is it Easter cactus? Mm-hmm. Trichoceros is the columnar cactus, and they have those giant flowers. They're really beautiful. In the summertime, you can water them almost like a tomato plant. Like they can really take water because they're growing. And so plants, when they're growing, can take a lot more water than when they're dormant. Plants rot when they're dormant and they're getting too much water. So anyway, the point being, is it's not always as simple as this plant's low water, this plant's high water. It's also what season is the plant in. And take a look at the picture that's up here right now. That is an elderberry. And down in the low desert, elderberries actually go dormant in the summertime. Now you don't hold water back on it because it's not a succulent plant. But there's something to know about with the seasonality of it, because if you let's say you get an elderberry and you plant it and you think you're doing everything right, and June comes along and it's yellowing out, and you think, what did I do wrong? And what it is that it's going dormant. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just going to sleep for a little while. Wolfberries do this too. And wolfberries are native right down here in the low desert. For some reason, something in their genetic memory, from, I don't know what their history was, evolutionarily speaking, but whatever it was, it didn't include a lot of summer rain in some places because they go dormant in June. Or maybe it's that they're saving water until the monsoons come, because right now the wolfberries are waking up. So, but if you don't know that, and you have a wolfberry and your wolfberry's yellowing out in June, you might think something's wrong. So know the seasonality of a plant. And oops, what happened there? The other thing I want that goes along with that is don't always expect your plant to always look amazing and beautiful and not ever have a yellow leaf. We get calls and texts all the time. Oh, there's yellow leaves on the lower part of the branches on my plant. What am I doing wrong? You're not doing anything wrong. Plants don't always look good. Most likely. Sometimes it's a sign. But a lot of times people worry about nothing. They see things, plants sometimes look tough. They don't look good. And it's because they're dormant or they're taking a break or whatever it is. Like there's various reasons why a plant can have some yellow leaves. You don't have to freak out about every yellow leaf. Try our new product called Chill Out. If you haven't seen the video, we have a video called Chill Out, and just go watch it. But anyway, plants have their on and off times just like you. The other thing you might want to ask about, and this is if you're following us and you're into what we do, you probably are into the wildlife aspect of things too. So ask questions. Do the people who are selling you the plant know about if it's a larval food plant, or did they have any special relationships? And in this picture, there's a Lucy's warbler, and Lucy's warbler is a bird that has a very special relationship with the native mesquite, Prosopis volutna. And when I say native mesquite, it's got to be truly native. Whenever you buy a velvet mesquite, always find out where they got the seed from, because mesquites are promiscuous. And we have a lot of different species growing in Arizona, and especially in Tucson and Phoenix and other places where it grows. And because of that, they hybridize. And so you can collect seeds off of velvet mesquite and think you're getting a velvet mesquite, and it's kind of hybridized. So we, our velvet mesquite seed comes from way out past Aber Valley, and there's no people out there. So like it's far away from where there might be any hybrid mesquites or any, Chilean mesquites or whatever. So that's an aside. But that is important in this discussion, because this bird really depends on the velvet mesquite, and there's a reason. The velvet mesquite has a very specific timing. It's the last to come out. You might have noticed it. If you have a native mesquite, it leaves out later than everything else. And some people see that as a not a great trait, but actually it's really important, because this bird has evolved to live here and to come, it migrates here and comes here at exactly the time when the leaves are starting to break, and there's a whole host of insects that are related. You never even see these insects. They're all up in the canopy of mesquites, but there's a lot of them up there, and it's amazing. Mesquites are like an ecosystem unto themselves, and the Lucy's warbler shows up at that time of year to get those insects. So if the mesquite's hybridized, or if it's not even a native mesquite, it's not going to have those same benefits for the Lucy's warbler. And it's been an issue that Tucson Audubon's been looking at to see if this is affecting them negatively. And I think that there has been some evidence that they are negatively impacted by the planting of non-native mesquites, at least in the urban areas. So really important to plant those native mesquites. Now, just so some people don't quite understand about hybridization. Once you plant a plant, it's always going to be that plant. Now, if you plant the seeds of that plant, it could be hybridized. But even if you have a Chilean mesquite growing right next to your velvet mesquite, it's not going to ever change the velvet mesquite into something else. It just, but the seed will produce something different. Long detour there, but the point is I want you to ask questions about the wildlife relationships with your plants too. It's just as important as sun exposure and water and all that. Another thing that I didn't put a slide in here, but is very important that I know people will ask, is what time of year to plant. And it's a question we get all the time. So I'm just going to, we did talk about this in the last class a little bit, but this class is more specifically related to landscaping plants. So in the nursery industry, they always tell you the fall is the best time of year to plant. And there's a reason they tell you. It's not necessarily true. I think they believe that it's true, but where it all came about, this whole fall planting thing, is number one, it's not summer anymore, and it's really nice out, and people want to be outside. Number two, nurseries have just gone through summer, and it's been really hard on them, and they want to make some money, so they really are trying to push sales. And so, so fall planting has become a thing. And along with that is the assumption that other types of year are not as good to plant. It's not true. Every type of year is fine to plant, but every type of year, or every time of year, has its own things to consider. Let's put it that way. So in the summertime is actually a really good time to plant. You might be stressed. It's hot for you, but if you're growing plants that are appropriate for this climate, especially native plants, they're fine with it. In fact, they don't want to be in that tiny little pot anymore. Plants don't want to be in a little black pot. They want to be in the ground. And so don't ever get a plant in the nursery and say, I'm going to wait till fall to plant this. You're actually causing more harm. Get that thing in the ground. Don't wait. But the consideration, though, is in the summertime, you have to water every day, and it's less forgiving if you don't. And that is where people fail, is they don't water thoroughly enough, or they don't water often enough. And most of the time, it's going to be every day. And here's the thing, except this year, most people go away during the summertime, and they have someone else watching their plants. And I'm going to tell you, Uncle Joe is not going to water the plants like he says he's going to. He is going to get stoned on the back porch one day and forget, and some plants are going to die. That happens to everybody, because everyone has an Uncle Joe that gets stoned too much. So the thing is, you can't depend on people to water every day unless it's you and you've made that commitment, or you know someone who really will water every day. But I'm going to tell you, every single day someone tells us a story where they went away and the plant died that they were trying to get going. So, I mean, I'm not even exaggerating. It's like every day someone says that to us. So, luckily this year you're all at home, or a lot of you are. I know some people still have to work, but a lot of people are at home. They're stuck home, and if anything, they're paying too much attention to their plants and freaking out about every yellow leaf. But the point I'm trying to get across is, if you plant in the summer, you just have to watch the plant more. There may be some yellow leaves. Sometimes when a plant's in a nursery and it's close to a whole bunch of other plants, and then it goes into the landscape out by itself, it has to get used to that, because it doesn't have as much of that localized humidity as those plants around it had, and maybe even some shade it got from the other plants. We try to have plants in a very similar situation as where it's going to go, but just be aware that there's going to be some transitioning going on. In the fall, there are some plants. It's a terrible time of year to plant them. Frost tender plants are not the best to plant in the fall, because if a plant's new and it gets some frost damage, there's a likelihood that it might not come back. A stronger likelihood that it won't come back after a frost, as opposed to having planted it in the summer or even the spring, where it had a little more time to get developed and the roots got a little more established, and then it got frosted. It's more likely to tolerate that. So there's another example of where fall planting is not necessarily a good idea. And that's the winter consideration. In the winter time, you want to be aware that the frost is coming. And is your plant, you've already asked that question, what's the hardiness of this plant? So if it gets close to the temperatures where it might have some issues with the frost, you're going to have to be out ready to cover it. Okay, so that's so the point being is that the time of year to plant you can always plant stuff, but there's always considerations. And again, fall and spring are not automatically the best time of year to plant. They are easier because if you forget to water in that nice fall weather, it's not as detrimental to the life of that plant as if in the summertime you forget to water. So anyway, next thing is this slide here is of a root system, and I kind of hate this slide because this is what you shouldn't do. So people also from other climates, they love to break up root systems in pots. First of all, plants always find their way out, even if they're fairly root bound. They almost always find their way out of a root bound situation. There are examples of that not being the case, but for the most part, roughing up the root system in this climate is usually not a great thing. Especially some plants. There are some plants that if you mess with the root system, they will die. Citrus, for example, if you plant a citrus tree and you mess with that root system, it's going to go. It's not going to make it. Bougainvilleas are famous for that too. If their root system is disturbed, they just die. So don't rough up the root ball. The only case where you might have to really pay attention to this rule, especially when we're talking about native plants, is large trees. So if you have a really large tree, when I say large tree, I mean like mesquite size or even bigger, eucalyptus, or whatever, like trees that get very large. And then if there's a big taproot going around about 3/4, circling around the root ball, it's still a chance that it won't be a problem at all, but it can be a problem. And so some people will wrestle that root out and kind of try to re-guide it. And you can do that with some trees, but here's the thing. There's going to be a cost. And the plant's going to most likely wilt. Some plants can take it. There are plants that you could pull out of the container and stomp on its root ball and it won't even drop a leaf. Coresia, if you know the kapok tree, you can stomp on it and it won't even drop a leaf. But for the most part, I want you to be tender and reverent with the root ball. Don't slash at it. Don't break it up. It's not a good idea. And it's something that people do in other climates. And I don't even think it's a good idea in other climates. But plants don't. A lot of the plants up in the north are different than our plants are, and they can handle it. And their climate, they can handle it too. But there's two things in this climate that kind of make that a problem for a lot of plants. One is that it's hot here and it's dry here, and there's a lot more resource taxation on the plant. So that's number one reason. Number two, we are subtropical, and tropical plants just behave differently than temperate climate plants. So anyway, try to not mess with the root ball whenever you can. Just and you don't need to worry about it as much. If it's a solid mass, you might have to do something, but hopefully your root systems are not often like that. But here's another thing too. A lot of native plants grow in really rocky soils, and they don't need to spread their roots out like crazy. Their tactic is they're geophytes. They grow in rocky soils, and so they're almost root bound in nature all the time. A good example of that is pine leaf milkweed. Doesn't need a lot of root space. They grow out of almost pure rocks. So, what they really need is the drainage. But anyway, a lot of our plants are not that needy of root space, and you can kind of tell this about plants. The more succulent a plant is, usually the more you don't even need to worry about it. If a plant's a monocot, you don't need to worry about it because monocots, their roots don't swell. And what is a monocot? It's a long story, but bamboo, grasses. If you have a grass, don't ever worry about the root system. What else? Lily family, agaves, and Anyway, just the general rule here is just don't mess with the root system too much. So basically, when you do get ready to plant, this is sort of a rough sketch of what you should basically kind of do. There's some different opinions about a few of these things, and I'll talk about them. There are a lot of people these days who say you don't need to add compost to the ground when you plant a plant. They say that desert plants need desert soil and they don't really need that much organic material. And some of this goes back to a study that was done back in the 80s, and the study where they planted a bunch of plants and some of them had compost and some of them didn't. And the plants all pretty much did the same. What they don't tell you about that study is it was done in an agriculture field. I'm not really stuck. I'm just annoyed. Anyway, the point being, you're not planting in desert soil. You're not planting in native soil. You're usually planting in disturbed soil. So compost is important. What I want you to see in this picture, let's talk about this picture for a second. What I do like about the thing they say nowadays is dig wider than deep, and that is true. It's important to go wide because the roots really do go lateral. That's most plants are going to go lateral. Some plants will sneak down some roots deeper, and those plants don't need a lot of help to do that. They'll do it anyway. The soil that you work up with compost, and usually it's like 1-to-1, or even a little less depending on the plant. But the backfill you can see there in the black and white dotted area, and then you can use some mulch. There's a couple things I want you to never do, almost never do, and with everything there's always an exception. But in general, if you don't know, do not bury a plant any deeper than it was in the container. Do not cover the base of the plant, the crown of the plant, with soil or mulch or anything. Like leave it open. If you bury the plant deeper than it was in the container, you can smother it. You can cause rotting. A lot of plants decline after this, and some people have been doing this, and this is the thing they're doing wrong. And there might be someone right now that's like, oh my God, really? That's what it is? It really does cause harm to plants, and they don't make it. And sometimes people, they've watered every day and they did all the things they thought they were supposed to do, but they did bury it deeper. And then it was in the container, and there was a couple inches of soil up on the base of the plant. That will kill a lot of plants, most of them almost. So don't do that. You can even see in the picture the mulch is pushed away from the base of the plant. But mulch is a good idea too. So let's get into that. We talked about compost. If the compost you make at home is always better, and if you have the ability and space and time to do it, and that's the next class too if you want to learn, compost made at home, even if you do it kind of sloppy, is better than most commercial compost, because commercial compost has to be the same. It has to be consistent, and it has to be stable in a bag. And there's a lot of other things that go into commercial compost that has nothing to do with how good it is. And that's the problem with buying crap, right? It's always good to do your own thing. So anyway, even if you do a bad, sloppy compost, it's going to have more nutrition in it than most commercial compost. But not everybody can do that, and if that's the case, don't freak out. Like, oh my God, it's still fine. It's still going to be fine to use some compost and commercial compost. And it has to say compost. Don't do potting soil, or sometimes there's mixes and stuff. But just get compost, and you're going to usually mix it. It's really, honestly, it's not an exact science, but it's about 1-to-1. And there's something else that you should know too. And that is, I want to go back to this picture here. The compost does go away. Well, it doesn't really go away. It goes into your plant. What happens is the microbes and the insects in the soil break down the compost and make it into food for your plant. And that's a very watered down way to put it. But yes, question.
I I was just going to mention, you talked about not covering up the root ball, but and planting. Just don't plant too high either.
Yeah, don't plant too high either. We had someone recently who had their plant sticking out of the ground. You can actually bring the root ball up a little bit. There's a picture I want to show. It's okay to bring the root ball up a little bit if you're very good at watering, and eventually, the roots are going to go lateral, and as long as you make a really good berm around the plant, and we're going to talk about all this, but I want you to remember that the plant's going to sink a little bit. And there's another thing you should know about too. There are some nurseries who use almost all compost in their soil mix. Not going to mention names because we don't do that, but potting soil that's all compost, the root ball is going to shrink and the plant will sink. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can cause some problems. And so always account for some sinking. Look at the soil of the plant that you're planting, and does it look really rich, like all compost? And if it is, be prepared that root ball is going to sink. And even if not, you're adding compost into the soil, that whole little bed will sink a little bit. But you kind of want that because it does make it easier for you to water it as well. Now the plant is going to keep rooting out more and more as time goes on, and the watering will happen actually when you're watering your other shrubs and stuff at some point. But anyway, the point being is that just know compost does decrease, and you will be adding, whenever you can, whenever you think about it, again, without burying the base of the plant, you want to add compost to the top, and it will provide nutrients down below. And the other way to get plant nutrition into the ground is fertilizer, but we'll talk about that later. And I don't like the word fertilizer, but organic plant food.
While on the subject of compost, someone asked, can you address the use of manure versus compost?
Yes. Manure is one aspect of what a good compost has. Good compost usually is made with manure. Now, a lot of commercial compost doesn't use manure, but it's another story. But think of manure as more like organic food. It's a lot more rich, and it's going to feed the bacteria in the soil as opposed to the fungus. And this is something we'll get into a little deeper in the next class. We'll get real deep into it. But a really quick answer to that question is that green waste and manure are bacterial foods, and wood and brown material is more fungal material, and you need a little bit of both in a healthy soil. And even in desert soils, a lot of people think desert soil doesn't have that. It's not true. We actually have a very our old growth forest is the saguaro forest, but people think we have to have redwoods to be an old growth forest, or pines or something. But our old growth forest in our region is, or in our elevation, is the saguaro cactus forest. And so the soil's thinner, but if you look at the microbes under a microscope, you're going to see a high diversity of microbes, the same kind of diversity that you would see in old growth forest. But that's kind of getting off subject and into the next class. But take that class. We really get heavy into that stuff. But anyway, when you add compost, again, around 50-50, and account for some shrinkage, you do want to create a basin, and so that's important. But the reason, this is what I was just talking about. Loads of organic material decomposes in the desert too. So just taking a look at this picture, at different times of the year, there's different plants coming up, and some of them are annuals, and they grow and they die, and all those plants have been doing that in a natural environment is what's creating the food that feed all the plants. Now, in the soil you're dealing with, its history is a little different, right? You didn't have eons of years of plants growing and dying, and animals defecating and dying, and all that stuff feeds plants.
If it did, it got scraped up.
Yeah, actually, the truth is it did have all those things, but they came along with the bulldozer and they scraped it all up. And what happens during the building too, they pour concrete on the ground. When they make concrete, slabs and they take the water from the concrete and just dump it on the ground. That's not good for plants. So we are not dealing with native soil when we're talking about planting around houses and planting in urban areas or suburban areas. You're usually dealing with, even in rural areas, they all have this terrible history in the soil. And, we rake up things and we just don't allow that organic material to build up. That is why you add the compost. You are trying to bring back that biology into the ground. It's a rough, it's not the same thing as what would have happened naturally, but it's the best way that we can come up with for now. And so it's definitely better than not doing anything. And when you dig the soil too, when you dig up to plant something, pay attention to what you're pulling out of the ground. You're gonna find some. I've dug up cars. I had a landlord who used to bury his cars like his dogs. So I was digging and I came on a roof. That happens. People bury the weirdest stuff, and when you dig a lot, like I have in my life, you find weird stuff. Countless unmarked graves of poor cats and dogs that I disturbed their grave. You'll find all kinds of stuff. So anyway, when you're digging up that stuff, some of it shouldn't go back into the hole, and that should be pretty obvious. But sometimes you'll dig and the soil looks almost like you could tell that they dumped a bunch of concrete water there. Don't put that back to the pot. To the soil profile. Get that out of there and just find some dirt from another part of your yard. Another really great idea is mulch. And when you say mulch and compost, they're two different things, right? Compost is richer and it goes into the soil to bring more organic material into the soil and feed the microbes that feed the plants. Mulch is usually a little coarser, and our favorite mulch is also a recycled product, and it's wood chips from landscape companies. And they trim trees and stuff, and then they bring them to places like Tank's Green Stuff. And this is actually from Tank's Green Stuff. Sometimes you can get it free, but it is kind of worth that sometimes. We don't mind paying a little money and getting the tanks, especially this grade. This is their finer grade because there's less thorns in it. In fact, there's almost no thorns in it. And that's what we use at the nursery. We can't have a bunch of thorns for people to step on in the nursery, so we get the nice stuff. And I don't like that at my house either. I'm barely dressed when I get up in the morning to water, so I'm wearing flip-flops and I've gotten the cheap stuff before and stepped on a mesquite thorn that's like 4 inches long. That's not a great thing to walk on. So Tank's Green Stuff, ask for their finer grade if you like what I'm saying, because it's pretty good. Now, if you're just putting them in basins of trees where you're not going to be walking at all, you can sometimes, there's companies out there, and don't ask me to list them because I don't even know them, but if you call around, you can usually find landscape companies who do a lot of tree trimming, will have excess of this stuff and they'll dump it off. There is a lot of demand on that right now because there's a lot of people doing some gardening. Gardening is like the new toilet paper during COVID-19. So everyone's doing it. So anyway, a lot of these supplies are low. But anyway, Tanks is not low on this stuff. So spend a little money and get it. It's not that expensive, to be honest. It's a lot cheaper than their compost, and makes a great mulch. Now, why do you add mulch? You add mulch because it's going to absorb the heat that hits the ground, and it kind of blocks the sun from pulling all the water out of the ground. So that does a couple of things. One, it's cooler for the roots, and the roots always like that. They don't want to be as hot as it is out here. And two, the moisture, it actually slows the evaporation down, so you're saving water. Three, when Katie and I first mulched our yard here, we really noticed a jump in wildlife. And why is that? Because when you have all those wood chips around, suddenly you get this whole layer of, the first thing that starts to come are the insects. And they're insects that are decomposing insects. And so they're under that bark. You don't even see them, so if you're really freaked out by bugs, which you shouldn't be, but if you are, you won't see them. They're underneath the bark. But what they're doing is they're decomposing that. And you will have to reapply this every few years, by the way, which is the drawback to wood chips as opposed to gravel. But
also the good thing, because it decomposes and feeds your plants.
It decomposes and feeds your plants. So it's adding to the biology. And that goes back to why those insects are there. But the insects also draw in birds. So we saw a jump in birds in our yard, and they're not the birds that go to the feeders. They're what we call ground gleaners. So canopy gleaners are like verdin and the Lucy's warbler that we talked about. They hop around in the tree canopies and eat insects in the canopies. Ground gleaners are like the house wren. The various wrens. Wrens love to kick around on the ground. What else? Towhees. Abert's towhee came into our yard. So there's certain birds that will come into your yard that you didn't have before because their food's there, the insects that they eat. So just, another aside, but it's not really aside because what are we doing? We're creating habitat. So it's a good thing. And so mulch is highly recommended. It's going to make, it also makes it 10 degrees cooler it feels. I don't know. We have a guy that waters on the weekends at the nursery because we try not to be there every day. And David, he's a really hard worker. And when we first mulched the whole nursery, he texted right away and he was like, "Oh my God, it's so much more pleasant in here." He noticed the temperature difference. You will notice the temperature difference. It also looks nice. It smells nice when it rains. So there's a lot of human reasons to do it too. I don't usually give a crap about human comfort. I care more about that wildlife, but it's nice. It's nice when it's a little cooler out and whatever. So anyway, mulch is a good thing. Question.
Somebody asked, with all the organic matter being added, is there any concern about mineralization of the soil?
Okay, so what people are worried about first of all, no. Let's start off with that. Also, people are worried about, depending on the kinds of organic material you put in the ground, they say too much wood and you're going to steal nitrogen from the soil or whatever. As long as you're adding in a balance of compost and and a balance of the woody material on the top isn't actually going to rob what's going on down underneath. In fact, it's going to increase it because you've created that habitat for those insects who create nutrients for the plants. So what we're talking about, that whole mineralization thing, I'm not even sure what people mean when they talk about that, because it's from a different perspective. It's from the perspective of using synthetic fertilizers and how available those are to plants. In an organic system, it's just totally different. You want to have a good balance between the richer stuff and the woodier stuff. That's important. We'll go into this in the next class too in more depth, but because the long answer is long and it's too long for this class. But I'll say this: if you're adding in around 50-50 organic material to soil, you're not going to have a problem. You're just not. If anything, in our soils especially, it gets eaten up so fast. There are people who get a little too excited and put in every fertilizer they can find, organic fertilizer even, and you can make things kind of complex and weird if you do that. Don't meddle so much, and we'll get into fertilizers in a bit, but in this class. But But it just suffice it to say, if you're behaving rationally and not going overboard with all this stuff, you're going to be fine. You're not going to have those sorts of problems. There is a concern with how you water, and that can cause problems, because if you're watering very shallowly, or you only have like one drip on a plant, instead of like putting a few different drips around, where that water stops, there's a buildup of minerals, or it's just crap. Our water sucks. Unless you're lucky enough to have your own well. City water is awful. It's full of. It's actually when they two biggest city in the world, solely on well water. Until, what was it, the 90s, early 90s, they changed over to CAP, and nurseries left town. There was a guy the nursery didn't leave the town, but the guy that used to own Arid Lands greenhouses, a specialist on euphorbias at the time especially, he left town because he had so many problems with the CAP water that he wasn't used to, and he was just like, forget this. Our water's that bad. Again, if you have a good organic material and you water correctly, you can keep flushing those nutrients out. And every once in a while, when you're watering your plants, when they're established, a really good flooding is a very good idea once in a while, because when you're watering, whatever your watering habit is, where the water ends, right? If you put a certain amount of water into the ground and the water reaches only so far, right? Where that water stops, there's a buildup of salt. And that's, I think, what people mostly are talking about with mineralization. And that is a problem, but it's not a nutritional problem. It's a hard water kind of thing. And it's not just the water, it's the soil too. There's a lot of salt in our soil. So it all builds up where the water stops. And that's not always a problem, because if you're watering thoroughly and nice and deep, the salts are pushed away far enough to where that buildup doesn't cause a problem. But if you're doing a lot of shallow watering, and or you're relying on only one drip for a shrub, and the shrub's like 5 years old, and you still get the one drip on there, that salt buildup layer is right in the middle of the root zone, and that's not good. So, one, water deep. Two, if you're relying on drip systems, add drips as the thing gets older, or plant more plants around it, so that you're watering those plants with the drip, and then able to get that water out there and pushing those salts away. I hope that makes sense. Watering. So when you first plant a plant, to have a very good system for watering, make sure that it's a nice basin that you can fill up, that you can thoroughly fill it up, because remember that here's another example where the middle is a little higher, but you can see that there's a nice well around. Now, if this plant was just planted, you would have to very slowly water right next to that trunk. So you have to be mindful of that. If you have a hose, you're going to put that hose on really slow and just let it trickle down. You can't just flood it really fast. But this is actually a good thing because of what we were talking about, that sinking that happens with organic material. Sometimes this is a really good way to do things. But you just have to be mindful about your watering, and are you getting that original root ball, because that root ball, when you first plant the plant, the roots are all in that one little spot. So it doesn't, you got to make sure that you're watering the whole profile. But when you're watching your plant, when you first plant it, and you're checking to see if it's moist, check the actual root ball. Don't check out in the side there, because that could be wet and the root ball can be dry. And that plant will wilt and die if it doesn't get the water it needs. So be mindful of that. And as the weeks go on, you will start to put more space between waterings. So right now you'd be watering every day, or every other day, depending on the type of plant it is, or how big. Sometimes a 15-gallon you can get away with every other day. But and then after a few weeks, you can start to put more time between waterings. But every time you put more time between waterings, you want to, there's a cat behind me. You want to watch that plant on that day that you skipped. So let's say, you know, on the third week, you decide to go to every third day. On that third day, watch the plant, make sure there's no wilting going on. You know what I'm saying? So, and then as time, you know, you're going to wean it into whatever your normal landscape watering situation is. And when there is no one answer as far as like how often should you water plants, you have to play with a couple of different things. You know, are you using drip irrigation? Are you using a hose to water? What's your soil like? What kind of plants you have planted in the ground? I mean, I'll generally say this, and don't take this as a dogmatic suggestion. But if you're watering most established landscape plants can be pretty happy on about this time of year, maybe 2 to 3 times a week. And we're talking about like their standard shrubs and trees and stuff like that, not cacti. But you know, 2 to 3 times a week. And there's some, well, let me back that up. I'm not talking about old trees, and I'm not talking about very large shrubs. I'm talking about like smaller landscape plants like perennials and ground covers and trees that are not as old. Once you get some of these plants established, especially a lot of native plants, you can go 2 weeks or even more without watering. And there are some plants that can go on rainfall. Now, if you do wean your plant to survive on rainfall, you do need to understand that it will not look good certain times of the year. If you go out there in the Tucson mountains right now, actually they're starting to bounce back a little bit, but man, things are looking rough out there. And there's some parts of the Tucson mountains that's still like the creosote bush looks terrible. And we're talking about creosote bush. So anyway, like yes, there are a lot of plants that can live on rainfall, wolfberries and gray thorn and desert lavender and palo verde, you know, foothills palo verde. But the thing is they're going to look rough certain times of the year. So that is the trade-off. If you're willing to let your landscape look rough, there's nothing wrong with it. But most people don't like that. But it's more than just a look thing too. It's also, I don't want you to ever feel bad about watering plants. Feel terrible about flushing the toilet. That's the worst waste of water ever. If you can figure out like some kind of outdoor toilet, no water situation, do it. I don't care if it pisses off your neighbors. That's the worst use of water ever because it doesn't really, it's not salvageable. But watering plants is the one time that we're taking that precious resource and we're actually giving it back to nature. And when you water a plant, you're watering insects and you're watering birds and you're watering microbes in the soil and you're like putting life back into the ground. There's no reason to ever feel bad about that. And I think a lot of people when they move here, they really become very conscious about water use, and that is so important. Please be conscious about water use, but be conscious about your water use. Don't deprive nature of water use. You know, you're not wasting water when you water plants. Let's just say that. You do want to, you know, go with our native plants and water them in a way that's good for them and not wasting water. You don't want to. I'm not telling you to waste water, but all I'm saying is that of all the things to feel bad about when it comes to water use, watering plants is not something to feel bad about. Except if you have a lawn, get rid of that lawn. Lawns are stupid. You're not going to hang out on the lawn anyway. I'm ranting. Let's go on. Let's talk about fertilizer. So the reason I hate the word fertilizer is because it makes people think wrong about plant nutrition. So first, let's talk about what is the difference between an organic fertilizer and a synthetic fertilizer, because you might kind of know the difference, but maybe there's some things you don't quite understand about it. Let's just say this. Organic fertilizers are and should be, if they're labeled organic, and they're not always labeled right, but organic fertilizers usually have low numbers, and they're usually made from raw materials. You know what it was before, okay? And they're natural. They're organic. They're organic material that decompose in the soil, and then when I say decomposes, there's organisms, microbes and insects and worms and grub worms. Grub worms are beautiful. They do the same work as earthworms. They don't kill your plants, but that's another thing. Organic food feeds the soil. It's not plant food. It's soil food. And then the soil feeds the plants, or the microbes and the plants work together to get that food. That's how plants are fed in nature. Synthetic fertilizer is usually, it's synthetic. It's a heavy salt. It's sometimes mined, but it's an unnatural, water soluble thing that the plants can take up right away. And so it skips the whole microbe thing. In fact, it kills the microbes because microbes get dehydrated by heavy salts. So when you use synthetic fertilizers in junction with organic fertilizers, you're actually undoing your good work. So I don't know if people are texting questions too. You might, if you can. I just realized that you might be texting questions too. But anyway, the point is, synthetic fertilizers are, think of trying to live off of coffee. What would that be like? You get that boost right away and then you crash, right? And that is, I just described agriculture. It's entirely synthetic. They don't care about microbes in the soil. They don't care about destroying the soil. They just feed the plant. And everything is based on that. That's why we're in such a mess. That's why we have to spray pesticides, and because the system's in balance. There's nothing there to keep things in balance. So anyway, when you're feeding with organic fertilizer, you're feeding the soil, which feeds the plant. When you use synthetics, you're just giving the plant a boost, and you're going to have to do that all the time because you're killing the microbes in the soil as well. There are organic foods that include synthetic foods, and it's the reason that they do that is synthetic foods make people happy, and the reason that they do is they really want to see they did this work, they did this thing to the plant, and it responds, and people love that. They put the fertilizer on, and it grows right away, and like, I'm a good gardener, I feel so good about this, and people love that. And the people who make these products, these capitalists know that, and so what they do is they put organic food and then they add ammonium phosphate to it, so they make you think you're doing the right thing, and you also get this immediate reward. Organic foods don't cause that immediate reward. It takes a minute. So let go of that. Take care of the soil, and the soil will take care of the plant, and the plant will be more solid and will give you, in time, with patience, will really reward you for feeding it correctly. But if you're feeding it inorganic food, it's not good for the environment. It doesn't just go away either. Like, that stuff ends up in the water table, and it ends up in the soil. Talking about that buildup of salts in the soil, that's another thing that people are probably asking about when they're thinking of synthetic food, because synthetic foods, the plant can only grab so much of that as it's coming along. And then, as I was talking about, when you're watering over time and that soil stops at a certain point, those salts build up there, and that's where that synthetic fertilizer ends up. And sometimes it ends up in the water table, depending on where you live, or if you're in a watershed, or right on the watershed or something. So anyway, that's why we're so big on this. And I think we are the only nursery that feeds organically all of our plants. We do not use synthetics, even in containers, because containers, they're a little harder to do organics in, and that's why a lot of nurseries kind of give up on that. They just say, "Oh, screw it, it's not a big deal." To us, it is a big deal, and so we want to not just sell you a plant. We try to sell you a plant that has microbes in the root ball, so that you have a little bit of a head start. That's important, but it is important for you to know too, because we're not expecting you to buy all your plants from us. But if you do buy your plant from somewhere else, don't buy it at Home Depot. Please, don't buy it at any of those chains. Go to local nurseries. But anyway, if you buy it at another nursery, just know that you got a little more work to do to build up the microbe population in that root ball. So anyway, that's foods. And so let's talk about these numbers, right? Here's chicken manure. You people were asking about manure. Now this is actually one of the products we sell. It's heat treated chicken manure, so it doesn't burn. If you to put manure directly on plants or directly in the root zone of the plants, most of the time they're going to burn because manure is hot and it's full of microbes and it's full of salts. So you need to compost it first, or in this case, heat treat it. Yeah, that's manure. That's something I didn't mention when someone asked about manure. Don't put a bunch of manure directly on your plants, especially chicken manure. And chicken manure is really hot. This chicken manure has been heat treated and dehydrated, so it's not going to burn your plants. But just know that most fresh manure it needs to be treated in some way. Usually, it's composted, and it's an important aspect of compost, which is the next class. We'll get into that, and we will talk in the next class a lot more about this. But just know what those three numbers are, right? So we saw on this there's 422 there, right? And this is 462. Organic foods should always have low numbers, not 25 or 30. That's you know that it's not organic if you see a number like that. The one fertilizer I can think of offhand that can have a higher number is blood meal. Can have a high nitrogen number. It can get almost up to 20 sometimes. So usually it's like 10 or 15, depending on how it's treated. But just know, like, bigger numbers usually means inorganic. The three numbers represent NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Nitrogen is now this is again a gross, watered down version of the story, okay? But just know in general that nitrogen usually is used for the green growth of a plant. It helps new growth and helps the plant get bigger. Phosphorus is usually for two things: root development and flowering and fruiting. So phosphorus is very important. Potassium is a very complicated nutrient, and it's not something we actually are out of in this. We have a very mineral-rich soil, and we have a lot of potassium in our soil, so we don't usually have to worry about this as much. But just know that it sort of helps with the immune system of the plants, and it also helps. It's a helper with the other two as well. It sort of helps nitrogen and phosphorus do its job. But the most important things to really pay attention to is nitrogen and phosphorus, because those are the two things you usually run out of in the soil. A good example is if you're growing in your garden, and now this is not a landscape plant, but if you're growing peppers and your fruit on your peppers get that kind of burned look on them, like a little like blemish, and it's like on all of them, that's called blossom end rot. It's usually caused by a lack of phosphorus in the soil. There's other reasons for it, but a lack of phosphorus is usually the thing. And that happens a lot in gardens because, if you just went through the winter garden and you had all these, greens and stuff, and then you get into summer, there's already been a toll on the soil. And so by the time you get into summer, the phosphorus is a bit depleted. So whenever you start your new garden, you want to add in definitely add in some phosphorus. But anyway, just so you know what those nutrients mean. And the only other thing that you should think about once in a while are the micronutrients. Iron magnesium, boron, copper, and all that. Now, you don't have to get too crazy about learning what they all do, because like I don't remember. But the important thing is that the plants need it, and here's why. If you look at us on a cellular level, we look just, aside from all our organs, aside from all what we look like on this gross level here, but if you were to take any of our cells and look at our cell and then compare it to a cell in the single-celled, oh my God, that was so hard. Single-celled critters in the ocean, which is basically what started life on this planet. It's the same. They look the same, and especially if you look at the mineral content in the fluid inside the cell, and not just the fluid inside the cell, but the fluid of the blood, the interstitial fluid, the liquid part of your blood looks almost identical to seawater, and with only one difference: there's less salt. And that is life. Like, we evolved outside of the oceans. All we are is we're like aquariums trying to live outside of the ocean. That's what life is. So a lot of those minerals come from the ocean, and as we do what we do to soil, we sort of deplete soil of those minerals. And so plants need those minerals, and they run out. In this case, in this picture, this is what iron chlorosis looks like. It's when the plant lacks iron. The veins will be green, and the plant will be yellow. But those green veins, and especially on new growth, you'll see this. This is like indicative of iron chlorosis. You don't need to really learn how to see all the signs of every kind of, what does a copper or magnesium deficiency look like. You just need to feed it some minerals, and usually that's it is a mined substance usually, but it usually comes from surface mines. It's just like old seabeds. So like a lot of it comes from Utah or places like that. So azomite's a good example of a very mineral rich fertilizer that you can add on once in a while to avoid all that. So again, I don't want you to go crazy over like, I'm going to feed all these things, because you can go in the deep end on this stuff and spend a lot of money, and there's always someone who wants your money. You don't have to do that. Just think your basic nutrients and do something for your minerals once in a while. And like once in a while, like maybe once a year or even less often. It all depends on the situation and what your soil looks like. Some people never need to do it. Because their soil is just really nice. But if you live near like an old mesquite bosque, the soil there is going to be pretty nice, and you probably will never need to add anything like azomite. But if you live in a foothills situation, and the soil is a lot more alkaline, and it's just it might be a little harder for plants to get those minerals. So just do something. There's other products out there besides azomite, and we'll talk about this in the next class too. I'll talk about other products and other things that are out there, but it's sort of overkill. Like, just if you're feeding something in your landscape, you're doing more than anyone else does. I'm going to tell you, like, nobody takes care of their plants. If you drive around Tucson, people don't feed their plants anything. So if you're actually feeding a little bit of a balanced fertilizer, and then you add an azomite on there or something like that, your plants are going to look so much better than everybody else's. And it's not a contest, but what I'm trying to get at is even a little bit of effort is going to make such a big difference. Let's talk about pruning, because I know people are going to ask. First of all, let's just say, whenever you can, don't prune. All right, plants don't need pruning. They didn't evolve with there's no gardener out in the desert pruning plants, right? So like, just like there's no gardener out there feeding plants, there's nobody fertilizing and pruning out there. There's debris falling on the ground, so the plant gets nutrients, and there's the plants just, they evolved not to be, they prune themselves sometimes, but there's nobody out there pruning. So first of all, number one rule, try to not prune at all. The only reasons that you really need to prune, particularly standard landscape plants, and especially native plants, is for human safety. If there's a thorny branch and it's right in the way of your walkway, that's when you prune. If you have a commercial business and there's rules about how much you're impeding the sidewalk, and you're going to have to prune up your trees there. So in general, like if you can avoid pruning plants, avoid it. Okay, but if you're pruning plants, just be real. You're doing it for you. You're not doing it for them. And that's okay. Like, I'm not saying we don't ever prune our trees. We totally do. I totally prune the trees next to the walkway because I don't want a thorny branch in my face. Or sometimes I'm making room and making more light underneath a tree, so I'll prune it up a little bit. If you are one of those people who think you're making a tree happen quicker by pruning it up, don't. You're not helping. I want you to remember that leaves are engines, and engines create energy for the plant. So whenever you remove those leaves or branches with a bunch of leaves on them, you are slowing the plant down. You might be making it look like a tree quicker, but it's not making the tree grow faster. So if you want to, let's say you have a mesquite and you really want it to be big, leave it alone as long as you can. And mesquites will really like grow, and they're going to get in the way, you know. So it depends on what kind of space you have. But if that mesquite grows, you let it grow wide like it really wants to, it will shoot up a lot faster too, because it's creating a lot of energy. And you know, but if you're pruning it up, you are going to slow it down, but it will look like a tree more. So it all depends on what you're going for. But just know that most of the time, if you're pruning a plant, it's for your convenience. It's not for the plant's needs. And so, and some of the reasons that people prune stuff too goes back to history that everyone has forgotten about. Like, I'm sure you've seen this. This is a mulberry tree, and you know, this is like this old Spanish tradition, and that's why you see it a lot here, because we live in former Mexico, and the Spanish brought this tradition here. There's a reason for this. There's a reason that people did this, and it has nothing to do with aesthetics. It's definitely not for the health of the tree, because every time they do this, this tree's, you know, it's knocking off a lot of years of its life. But back in Spain, back in the day, they needed those long whippy sticks, and so whenever you prune a branch like that, you wake up these little cells that are in the branch that create these long branches, and they're very insecure. Like, the bigger those branches get, the more likely they're going to fall out, because those buds are right underneath the bark, and so they don't have a lot of integrity. But the plants do it for survival, you know, to create more branches for leaves if they get, you know, browsed by some giant herbivore that doesn't exist anymore. But that's why plants do it. The reason the Spanish did it was because they were making baskets. They were, using those long whippy sticks for basket making and other building materials. So that's where it came from. If you ever wanted to know why people do that, people don't know anymore now. It's just this weird aesthetic that people have, but that's where that came from, just so you know. Oh, hold on. There we go. Now, where I was getting at is, like, it depends on what your needs are too. Like, this guy, I think he likes that tree the way it is. Most people would be like, I need to prune that thing up. This guy's like, I live in Tucson and it's hot, and this is a perfect place to park. This would probably be our house. But anyway, the reasons you prune, it all has to do with human needs usually. If you're specifically growing things for wildlife, and I know a lot of you are, leave it alone as much as you can. But when you do have to prune, do it right. So, actually, I think I have a better picture in here. Yeah, so, and again, this isn't a pruning class, and this is another subject that we could spend a whole class talking about. So this is going to be the watered down version of it. But if you need to prune to the collar. The collar is not always evident on a plant, and not all branches have a collar, but as often as you can, you want to look for that collar. It usually looks like this picture does, with that little swelling around the base of that branch. The reason you do those 3 cuts, see that first cut there in the middle, and you go in from underneath, and then you cut on the second cut, you cut all the way through on the outside. What you're trying to do is prevent bark stripping. So that first cut goes under like halfway, but it's basically to cut that bark so that when you do that second cut, if that branch comes slamming down from gravity, it doesn't shred the bark all along with it and strip down the tree. And then the third cut's just to finish that off, and you want to bring it close to the trunk, but you don't want to flush. You're not going for flush. You're going for that collar, and that's that prune. A good pruning job will heal a lot better because there's hormones inside of that collar that help it heal a lot better than if you're to cut deeper into the wood. So again, actually, if you look under those orange pruners with the orange handles, you can see that's a really good cut there. You can see that's what a prune branch should kind of look like. Is there's a nub kind of, but it's not big. You're leaving the collar, and that's going to heal a lot better. You don't buy the pruning seal. That stuff is garbage. It's just crap that people are trying to sell you. It actually causes more problems than it solves. Plants heal themselves so much better. That paint will sometimes seal in moisture and then cause fungal development underneath. So it actually causes more harm than good. So just cut it and leave it. Don't paint your trunks white. Don't do that. Just don't do that. Here, let's talk about staking. So one thing I want you to realize, a lot of people say, should I take the stakes out? Yes. Most of the time, staking in the nursery is done for the convenience of the nursery, because we have a lot of plants we're trying to get out of each other's way, and if we didn't grow the tree that we're selling, we will sometimes get them in, and they have these. We actually try to take the stakes off right away, because plants need to blow around a little bit to develop the callicine that makes them strong. And so too much staking actually makes a tree dependent on the stake and weak. And so you want to first of all, just cut it off right away. Even if you're going to stake your tree, cut that thing off right there. You see that picture where that bamboo stake is right next to the trunk like that? That's terrible. And this picture is actually from another nursery, not in Tucson, but and this is their example of how to properly stake. It's a terrible job, and I'm using it as an example of what not to do. Why is this bad? That bamboo stake's rubbing on the tree. Even if they got that wrap around the base there, it's still going to rub around the tree, and it's also not letting it blow around at all. What you want to do is stake a plant such that that it can blow around a little bit, and this is like the sort of traditional Tucson way to do it, where you have like 2 poles, and then you have the bands, which I wish I could zoom in on here, and I can't. We're learning the software to do these classes, and I don't know how to zoom in on that. But basically, there's wire that's going around, and then they cut a piece of old hose. And you could buy stuff too, but why buy when there's like garbage everywhere? Don't buy new stuff. Go find an old hose and cut it up, and then use that to protect the tree from the wire. But you're not wrapping it around. You're just kind of bringing it around one side, and then that's what that stake is on the other side, to bring it around the 2 sides. And then what you have is a tree that can blow around a little bit, and the wire's not going to damage the bark of the plant, and but it allows the plant to callus and develop its own strength. Now, most of the time you don't have to even do this. In fact, I think both of those trees, definitely the one on the right there, I wouldn't have staked at all. you don't normally need to stake plants. If a plant's looking a little on the weak side, and it's not holding itself up very well, you may need to stake it. Every once in a while there is a reason to do it, and it all depends on the kind of plants that are out there and how they were grown in the nursery and stuff like that. But every once in a while, like there are some plants that like a lot of oaks when they're in 5 gallons can be kind of like top heavy and weak wooded, and it's not until they get into that 15-gallon pot where they can really get big enough to like start holding their own. There are some species that don't look strong when they're younger, and you have to stake them a little bit. But you can tell, you can see that it's like not holding itself up. Most of the time, you don't need the stake. Let's just say that almost all the time. But when you do stake, do it properly and do it in a way that the plant can blow around. Caliche is calcium carbonate. It's chalk, or it's concrete is what it is. And it comes from eons and eons and eons of water stopping at a certain place and building up salts. Or it comes from parent rock beneath very eroded soil. But it's a buildup of calcium carbonate, and it is literally concrete. So some of you are dealing with this, and if you are dealing with this, what you need to, there's a couple things you need to consider. One is the bigger plant you're planting, especially like trees that really need a lot of root space, you're gonna have to get a jackhammer or something to really break up. They have those caliche bars, these really heavy bars. That's, if you like pain, that's a good way to do it. You can rent a jackhammer from several. There's actually local places that rent equipment. Actually, I rented a backhoe once, and I can't believe they brought it and dropped it off at my house and let me use it. I almost toppled it over. The guy's like, "Dude, have you ever driven this before?" And I was like, "No." And he, this mine. All you got to do is this. Is how you go back and forth, and this is how you lift the bucket. And he just kind of showed me, and then that was it. He dropped it off. I couldn't believe it. Anyway, you can rent a backhoe, but just get a jackhammer. You get those little guys and do some damage with those. But you're gonna have to, get past the caliche. You're gonna have to watch out for drainage. Drainage is going to be an issue if you have a bunch of soil on top of caliche, especially. Let's say some yards you have you go down a foot or a foot and a half, and then it's solid rock or solid caliche. There's going to be anaerobic activity down there. Anaerobic meaning no oxygen, because the water is going to go down and it's just going to stop right at that rock, and it's going to be no oxygen and swampy down there, and it's not good for plants. So you're going to have to do something about that. And there's, every situation requires its own actions, but you might have to dig past that, or dig or jackhammer a little way for the water to get out of that situation. But anyway, I thought I'd address that quickly. Also, just think about growing plants that naturally grow in those situations, the plants that love super rocky soils and that you won't have to water very often. That might be the route you have to go to. If you live in a foothill area that's been eroded a lot, like we live on the base of a mountain, and there's a lot of yards in this neighborhood. They're on these steep slopes, and they've been eroded for years. And so there's just solid rock sticking out of the ground. It's caliche. And, they're limited as to what they can grow. And that's just the way it is. You might have to, if you're in that situation, you may have to go up. You may have to do a large container, a large raised bed, and think containers, because that's just what you're dealing with. This is from Brad Lancaster's book, and why can't I think of the name of it right now? Idiot.
can't remember.
Brad Lancaster is our local permaculture guru, and we sell his books, both of them. And there's volume 1 and volume 2. And anyway, it's all about permaculture and how to take advantage of rain. And something I usually talk about right away, but I think I forgot to. Before you plant anything in your yard, before you especially if you're starting from a scratch, do what they say. Do what they call plant the water first. And what that means is grade your landscape so that the water goes away from human structures and goes towards where you're going to have your plants, whether it's your garden bed or your landscape. Make the water go to where the plants are going to get the water. And you will bring down your water bill. The plants will be a lot happier. When the rains come, I can't even tell you how much they respond to it. Like, you can water with CAP water all you want in June and July, the beginning of July, and the plants just sit there and it's like, I'm not doing nothing. This sucks. They just sit there. And then the rains come, and the plants you've seen, I'm sure, like most of you, if you've been here a while, you know that look. They green up and they lush up because that water is so much better for plants than our crappy tap water. So plant the plants first, and then as you plan your landscape, think about where that water is going to go. In the lowest parts of the basins is where you want your thirstiest plants, and then as you go up the slope, then you get to drier and drier plants. And of course, around each plant's going to have its own little well and stuff like that. But the more you mimic what nature does, the better the better experience you're going to have, because you're working with something that took millions of years to evolve, and it's a lot. Evolution is figured everything out, and much better than what you're going to come up with in your whole lifetime. So go with nature always. But just I want you to always think about this when you're looking at your landscape. I want you to always try to make it so that your plants are in the lowest part of the yard. And you don't want a bunch of water at the base of your house anyway. You don't want it to ruin your foundation. So make that the higher part of your yard. And don't worry about termites. If there's more dirt against the foundation, termites eat. They like rotten wood. They like dead wood, and not the bark. I'm sorry, not the wood chips. They like solid pieces of wood, usually your foundation. And so if some of that wood's hitting the ground, then you're going to probably have a problem. But up against concrete, having that extra dirt there is going to actually be better for you, because it'll be drier there. And then insects like termites, they don't really actually want to be near your house. They usually are, because it's the moistest part of the yard. So if you're driving that moisture away from your house and towards those landscape beds, termites actually are good for the soil, and they're great. That's not something to actually be afraid of. It's just when they're encountering your house that it's an issue. And they're everywhere, so don't think you're going to be able to totally purge them from your landscape. They're there already. But whether they're getting into your house or not all depends on how much of the wood of your house is contacting the ground. Pest companies don't want you to believe that, because then you'll stop using their services and come up with cheaper and better solutions. But the truth is like those insects are always around. They're actually good. They belong here more than we do. But they don't actually even really want to be in that situation. They want to be in the landscape. And again, don't worry about your live plants when it comes to termites, because they don't damage. They don't usually go into green wood. They'll eat off the dead wood off of an old mesquite tree, and then they stop. Usually, they don't kill trees. So one thing you'll see over and over again as we go through all these classes is this constant theme of we've been sold narratives about wildlife, and it's done. The narratives have been sold to you by people who don't know anything about wildlife. They just have a product to sell. And so you're going to see that often in these discussions. This is just another image of from the Brad Lancaster's books. These are cutouts. Sometimes you have to get permission, but if you just do it and don't ask, you could just say like, "Oh, that was there when I bought the place. I don't know what you're talking about." These are cutouts, and they're allowing you to take advantage of the street water, and that's a good source of water too. So get that water free whenever you can. So now I'm going to open it up to questions that you might have or experiences that you might have. If your question involves a picture, use that text number on the screen there, and we can answer questions about stuff you might have going on. If you have a plant that's like you just planted and it's suffering and it's got a certain type of yellow leaf on it and you're not sure if it's a problem or not, just text us a picture and we can take a look at it. The better the picture, of course, the better we can answer the question, or just ask questions. That's what this part of the class is. And I don't know, I might have answered all your questions and maybe you don't have them, but I'm sure there's a few at least. So do you have any?
I've got a couple. So someone asked, is there anything I should know before planting a garden on the east side of our house? And is there any issue planting in close proximity to that east-facing wall?
Okay, good question. When you say garden, I'm going to automatically assume vegetables and herbs, maybe flowers. But I'm going to talk also about shrubs and trees too, because people often ask about, is the roots of this plant going to get into my water pipes or my foundation? So anyway, let's talk about that. The first thing I'm going to say about, if you are talking about like more than just vegetables and herbs and you are talking about bigger plants, I'm going to tell you, don't put an elephant in your living room. It will knock your lamp over, right? So in the case of plants that get into water pipes, most plants and even most trees aren't going to be an issue with that. It's big trees, and particularly trees that are native to riparian areas, right? Mesquites, blue palo verde, not the foothills, but the blue palo verde, maybe a hackberry. These are all really big trees, like 40, 50 feet tall. So they have expansive root systems, and if there's a crack in your water somewhere, they're going to get into it'll start as a thread and it'll get into the water pipes and then expand inside the pipe and cause problems. And now that's true about dicots. Monocots, which are like grasses and agaves and bamboo, they don't have that same issue. You can plant a timber bamboo, which is that big culm. They have like the fat culms and they grow like 50, 60 feet tall or even taller. There's actually some that grow like 100 feet tall. They'll never bother your pipes or your foundation because monocots don't have roots that swell. When a root comes out of a monocot, it will always be that thickness. It doesn't expand. Dicots, which is most other plants, have the roots come out as a thread, as a single cell thread, and it expands, and you can go from a thread to like a fat root. So anyway, when it comes to like large plants, don't put giant trees right next to your house. Think about the canopy. If it's okay if the canopy will eventually kind of like touch the house, then you're probably okay. Unless it's like a really big tree, like a eucalyptus or something that gets giant, then you're going to have to, if it's a very upright growing thing, but it gets a trunk that's this fat, get that thing away from your house. Don't put it too close because an elephant will knock your lamp over. Most shrubs and ground covers and definitely perennials are not going to cause problems in your foundation or your pipes. So there's no issue with that. Now you said the east side of your house, that's morning sun and afternoon shade. I'm assuming you mean east facing.
Let's see. It's on the east side of the house. And then
East facing wall.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's morning sun and afternoon shade. And depending on how close you are to the house, of course, the further you get away, the more sun, that those plants will get. Most plants can take a good amount of sun too. So now, if you're talking about like a vegetable garden, our vegetable garden, which was the last class, and it's archived. If you go to spadefootnursery.com and click on online classes, you'll find a button for the archive. You can go check out our older classes, which is only one right now. This will be on there tomorrow. But there's the vegetable and herb class, and you'll have to skip over to like minute 20 because we started recording too soon. But anyway, we go over all the stuff on vegetable gardening in there. But we do talk about the sun in that class. And in general, like sun's not the issue usually. I have started getting around to shading my vegetable garden with the thinnest, like 30% or lower. And it is a little easier. It makes things a little easier, but it's not required. And shrubs and ground covers and trees, most of them don't need that shade. So a little break is not bad, though. And you might think of, there's some plants that do need a little like afternoon shade. If you want to do like an elderberries actually really appreciate shade in the afternoon in this climate. So that's a good place to put an elderberry. As long as it's not too close to the house, but they don't get that big. They're smaller trees or large shrubs. Again, just don't plant an elephant in your living room.
If it's a garden, is it going to get too much shade?
Not if you don't have any trees or something in the way. So morning sun and afternoon shade is actually kind of ideal. It's not bad at all. You do give up a little bit on. There's give and take whenever you introduce more shade onto the vegetable garden. You do make it easier for you, but sun is what plants use to create fruit. So especially the fruiting plants like tomatoes and peppers, they might not fruit quite as much as they would in full sun. But then again, that afternoon break in the summer is kind of good too. So because it's hot, and tomatoes do stop fruiting at a certain temperature usually. We talk about the exceptions to that in the other class, so go check that out. It's on there, and it's up there, and you can watch that class. But east side isn't too much shade. Again, depending on how close you are to the wall, and how it also depends on how tall your house is too. Like, I don't know, there's not too many people who have like 2 or 3 story homes or 4 story homes. Like where I grew up in New York, the houses are all giant. Here, everything is like one level. But if it's really a higher roof, then you might be talking about a lot more shade than if you have only a single story. So, and again, how close you are to that wall makes a difference too.
Okay, so somebody asked about Cleveland sage and dormancy and water.
So when I was talking about water and dormancy, when I first brought that up, I was talking about cacti, and cacti are very rot prone. With herbaceous plants that go dormant, you don't want them to go bone dry. You still want to water them. And in fact, in our landscape, we don't even change the watering at all. And on the landscape plants, it's more. I think what do we have? Like we're watering. We have some new plants in our landscape, but I'm watering like every 3 or 4 days right now. I think on the landscape, and I could go a little bit more now because the newer plants are getting more established. But where I'm getting at is plants that go dormant, like your wolfberries or Cleveland sage. Cleveland sage, for those of you who don't know, it's a great smelling plant with beautiful blue flowers. Hummingbirds love it. It smells. It's a salvia. It's a sage, and it smells like Bergarten sage, or maybe a little stronger than that. You can actually cook with it. Oh wait. Mm-hmm. But anyway, it's Cleveland sage is native not to Cleveland. It's named after a botanist, not the city. But it's native to Southern California and almost into Arizona. But but it's a Southern California native, and the Southern California is known for its like plentiful winter rain and dry summers, right? So that plant has evolved with that situation, and what, as a consequence, it sort of goes dormant in the summertime. It's active in the wintertime, and it goes dormant in the summer. So it doesn't go fully dormant. It doesn't drop all its leaves, and it just kind of looks meh. Like it looks like it's kind of sick or something. But it's just gets a little yellow, or just kind of like it just looks tired. And so we just stay the course. We just keep the landscape watering, normal. And when I say normal, like you don't want like water sitting. You don't really ever want sitting water. So make sure that there's no sitting water. But just normal landscape watering, and just stay the course. And then it'll bounce back. Usually, sometimes with the monsoon rain, or sometimes it'll even wait a little longer when it cools off, and then it really takes off. If you're just getting the plant started, you still have to like water it every day. And in fact, sometimes a newer plant will just skip that dormancy. If it's like brand new and you're watering it a lot, it'll just skip that dormant period and keep growing because it's brand new. Plants are they take advantage of any situation they can, if they can. So especially when they're young and new.
Okay. This person says, I think that my garden is suffering from either a Mosaic virus from tobacco I planted last season or really bad Downy mildew. How do I go about recovering?
Okay, so I'd have to see a picture of what's going on, but there's a couple things there. So I don't know. Like again, it's hard to diagnose a plant without seeing it. But there's a few things that plague our plants here. It also would help to know what kind of plant it is, too, that we're talking about. Powdery mildew is caused by not enough light, usually, on a plant. And there's certain plants that are more prone to it than others, like a rose is very prone to powdery mildew if it doesn't get enough light. There is a problem called, there's a insect called a leaf miner, which is a little insect that burrows inside of the leaves and causes a mosaic-like look. And that's just cosmetic damage. It's just a little insect that burrows through the leaves. It's nothing to really worry about. It goes away. And in fact, most problems are that. Most problems are things that if you're meeting the plant's needs, if it's getting the right sun and getting the right light, and you're not going to war with the insects and killing off all the good ones, then you're normally the problem usually fixes itself. Insects that in a natural situation, especially if we're talking about native plants, it doesn't make sense for them to kill their host. They usually take advantage of their host for a certain period of time and then they go away. That's very typical. Did they answer, by the way, what kind of plant it was?
They're going to send a picture.
You're going to send a picture, yeah.
So someone else asked, should I pull out a Meyer lemon that's not doing well and put in a Lisbon lemon instead?
Both are great lemons. But if the Meyer's not doing very well, you want to figure out what's going on first. It should be fine. You want to look at the watering and stuff and how much sun it's getting. You don't want to put a plant in the same situation that, especially related, one's doing well. One's not doing well, and then you put the same type of plant but different variety in there. You could have the same problem if there's something wrong with the situation. If it's not enough sun or whatever, you want to deal with like what's going on. So make sure the plants get enough water. And citrus do need food. They're not native, and they do need to be fed organic. But you do need to remember that they're going to need some feeding, particularly phosphorus, because it's a fruiting plant. So the middle number on your fertilizer. Make sure it's getting enough food. Citrus, by the way, naturally get that yellow burning on the top. That's cosmetic. We live in a very hot place, and the sun's very intense here, and that top layer gets yellow. It's nothing to freak out about. Like every citrus tree in Tucson basically looks like that, unless it's getting some afternoon shade. But it's nothing to worry about too much. Now, whether you pick a Meyer or a Lisbon lemon it might have more to do with what you like. And if that's the case, and the Lisbon is more like what you're looking for, then maybe that's the reason to go for it. And then you might be more apt to giving that plant what it needs. If it's something you really like, and don't grow something that especially if you're talking about a domestic edible crop, don't grow something you don't use, or if you do, take care of it and trade it for something you want, But most people are going to be more apt to taking a good care of a plant that gives them what they want. So,
someone asked, how do you know when to harvest watermelon?
There are lots of tricks. The one thing that I know about is the last little tendril after when you have the fruit and there's that little squiggly tendril when it goes brown, the little squiggly thing on the stem that goes to the fruit. When it turns brown, that's one way of telling. Honestly, wait as long as possible. People make people pick watermelons too soon all the time, and I've done it myself so many times because I get so excited, and I want to, I remember one year I grew the Moon and Stars watermelon. It's this giant watermelon, and I grew so many of them, and I kept picking them too soon because I was excited. It's so big, it's got to be ready, right? My advice to you is just wait, and then wait a little longer because it's probably going to take longer than you think. And but yeah, that's the thing I've always heard. People tap them and stuff. I don't know how much credence I'd put into that. Or what you really, I'm deaf, so I don't know, tapping on there and listening to it, a guy like me who's destroyed his hearing. And, I played music when I was a kid and ruined my hearing, so that's not going to work for me. But I look for that little tendril.
Somebody asks, what about plant-specific food, like for bougainvilleas?
Yeah. Okay. So, always realize that people are trying to sell you stuff. Okay, and so anything that comes from a big company, and I know I'm going to sound anti-capitalist, and I am, but here's the thing: you have these companies, and they're always trying to make more money. So what they do is they repackage the same crap that they have, but then they put a different label on it. So they're just this is for roses, and this is for, and sometimes there's something to it. Like palm food has more magnesium in it because palms use more magnesium. But if you were just using a basic general fertilizer, and then you added the mineral fertilizer, like I was talking about, like azomite, you won't run into those problems. And for the most part, most of that stuff is bullcrap. It's garbage. Now, there is a little bit of a difference between feeding, if you're talking about vegetable gardening, though in Arizona, we mostly grow greens and root crops and in the wintertime. And then the summertime, we have the nightshades mostly: eggplant, tomato, pepper, basil, which is not a nightshade, but most of your summer crops are very fruiting oriented, so phosphorus is more important. So you're going to have to kind of emphasize the phosphorus on a plant like that. On a plant that flowers a lot, or you're trying to get to flower a lot, you might emphasize that middle number. On a plant that you're emphasizing the green growth on, you're going to emphasize the first number. But really people are just trying to get you to buy crap you don't want. We were talking about grub worms earlier. Grub worms were demonized by an industry that wanted to make more money. So grub worms don't kill plants. Okay, I'm going to just say that. Most grub worms grow up into being these really cool looking beetles. And anyone who's had a compost pile, and I said this in the last class, but anyone who's had a compost pile and you've dug up the compost, have you ever noticed how many grub worms are in there? Why are they in there if there's no roots in there? They're in there because they're eating detritus. That's what grub worms eat. And so, but anyway, a long time ago, the pesticide companies, they were trying to rebrand some of their pesticides, and they realized that people are so freaked out by grub worms because they're creepy, you know, and so they freak people out. And they turn into beetles that freak a lot of people out too. So it was a real easy critter to demonize. What I'm getting at is people try to get you to buy stuff. And so the consequence of that is that they sold a whole lot of this pesticide, and it's a terrible pesticide. It kills a lot of things, and it's terrible, terrible for your health. But they did that, you know, they were repackaging something they already had. And that's the case with most fertilizers, especially the synthetic fertilizers. And I mean, if you're going to Home Depot, especially in a place like that, they, you know, they're all giant companies, and they're all, they're there to please those shareholders, right? So like, you know, they're repackaging that stuff and selling more and more stuff, and they get you, you know, to buy all this extra stuff. Again, just always think about nitrogen and phosphorus, right? Do I want more green growth, and do I want some more fruiting, or a little of both? And if you're adding in a balanced fertilizer, you're most of the time not going to have an issue. And like I said, once in a while, add in some micronutrients, the minerals.
Oops. Let me double check. All right, I think that's it.
All right. Looks like we answered everyone's questions. We'll always keep answering questions. You can always message us. You can email us, Facebook, Instagram. We're pretty responsive on all those things. Someone asked advice on digging earthworks around established trees and shrubs. Right. So you are going to have to, if you've got a landscape that's already been established and you're trying to grade such that the water goes towards the plants, one of the things you're going to run into with established landscapes is it's already kind of done, and maybe the people who planted the landscapes before didn't have that in mind, so the trees are a little bit higher up and the house is lower and stuff. You're always going to have to deal with the reality of what's already there. But do remember this. Particularly trees, most of the water that's being absorbed is being absorbed at the end of the drip line of the canopy and out. Actually, some people actually think it's the drip line and in, but it's actually the drip line and a little bit out, especially mesquites and especially larger trees. So you don't have to actually make the base of the tree that low. On an established tree, because it's really taking up that water on the ends. So it's a little bit easier to dig up along the edges there. And actually that's good for the plant. Some root disturbance on an established tree will actually cause more branching, and it's better for the tree. In nature, there's disturbance all the time. And getting back to grub worms do nibble on roots once in a while on established plants. Or in your vegetable garden. We have grubs in our vegetable garden, and that nibbling that they do causes more branching, and so it's actually good for the plant. They don't kill your tomatoes. If someone told you that grub worms killed your tomatoes, they're just trying to sell you something. But the point being is, if you have an established plant, a tree, or even a large shrub, just remember that it's the edges that you're considering. So if you can get that down a little lower, and then plant other plants around it, then you're doing a service to that plant. And that's actually how I think about doing when I do a landscape. and I plant like a tree and then I plant some shrubs and stuff, you always want to think about like where the roots are going. So usually out away from the plant. The roots expand like twice the width of the plant usually, and so eventually, and so as you're planting plants around, all together, and you're watering these other new plants over here, you're usually watering some of the older plants, and you know this, right? Because when you dig up, when you're digging up the ground, you find the roots, and so you know that the roots are from other plants are impacting the plant that you're digging up for. And don't be too concerned about what they call competition. The competition in the ground with roots is not as serious a thing. I mean, it is. Let me back up. Under an established mesquite trees actually can really be tenacious. But it's not just the roots of the mesquite tree that are causing that problem. It's also the light. There's light competition. But in general, like with shrubs and perennials and smaller plants especially, in nature they all grow together just fine, and it's even better in cultivation because we're supplying a more steady supply of water usually and food and stuff if you're doing it right. So you're not going to have too much of that competition, or there's competition, but it's not harm. The plants aren't harming each other. Oh, and when people ask about things like, is the creosote bush going to stop other things from growing around it because it poisons the soil or something like that? That's actually not a thing in the Sonoran Desert. The creosote bush in the Mojave Desert and in really, really dry places where there is nothing else growing but creosote, it does poison the soil a little, not poison, but it just makes it inhospitable to a lot of annuals. And that's because it's so dry there, and the buildup from the resins from the plant underneath it, that does cause it there. But the Sonoran Desert has more rain than any other desert in the world, and that's not an issue here. It is an issue under the salt cedar, which is a tree that has been brought in from Africa. There's two species. There's the one that is a problem in the washes and it's reseeding and it's like an escape. And then there's the old salt cedars, Tamarisk aphylla. Those are those giant fat trunks. Sometimes people cut them all the way down and they grow right back. Very few things can grow under that because salt cedars pull salt out of the ground, deposit it on the outside of the leaves, and then shed the leaves and then create a layer of salt. So in that case, there's some soil soil altering, but not under a creosote. In fact, in the Sonoran Desert, the creosote bush is a not mother plant, but nurse plant, yeah, or mother plant. But it's saguaros actually need the creosote bush to, when they're young and tender, and they grow up underneath the creosote bush, and then they get big enough to emerge out of it. And it's a nurse plant for most trees and shrubs and other plants, so it doesn't actually cause that same thing. All right, thanks for checking in. And oh yeah, that's not a white power thing I did. If you know me, I would never do that. That was really an okay thing. Oh, these times we live in. For anyone who might have come in late to this, we'll archive it so you can watch the beginning, and or if you need to rewatch it again. And again, send us any questions that you have. Next week we'll talk about soil nutrition, plant nutrition, soil, and compost tea and that sort of thing. So, bye.